Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. This is a pre-recorded version of Drumversations. As I said last week, I had to work. I am at work, but here with you at the same time through the magic of technology. We want to talk about reimagining education and adding value as an extension of last week's conversation. But even though we're not live, I still want to take time to breathe and honor our ancestors. So breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in and out. Remember, as you breathe in, you're breathing in all the goodness the universe has for you. And you're breathing out all the anxiety. Breathe in all the love, joy, and happiness in the universe. Out all the crazy. Ashe. So, we will honor the ancestors, even if we can't call them because it's asynchronous for this episode. Please put them in the chat so everyone else can honor them, and you can honor them just by typing their name. And we say Ashe for all the ancestors who are called and uncalled, typed and not typed. I'll play the ancestral drum call. Ashe, Ashe, oh. We, again, honor all of our ancestors, not only because it helps us remember the important people in our lives, but it helps us remember who we are and how we became who we are, right? We are the sum total of the investments that other human beings have made in our lives. So again, today, we want to continue the politics of humanity conversation. We started it by saying that one of the ways to change the country, and by extension even the world, is to begin to practice a politics of humanity in the context of the political divisiveness that we see even as we get closer and closer to election day, and all the crazy stuff that's coming out in terms of misinformation and, the battle between what a fact is versus an opinion, and, the idea that civil discourse is really not something that exists in the way that some people see it. And in other contexts, civil discourse is being used as a means of silencing voices. I think one way to cut through all the BS is just to completely change the way we think about ourselves and each other. And the outcome of that, I think, would be the practice of a politics of humanity. And toward getting to that practice of that politics of humanity, we were just thinking about how a culture shift, reimagining education, and reimagining value in terms of how we value ourselves and what we think about as even wealth as an extension of value is, at the macro level, the process to get to that politics of humanity. So we talked about the culture shift. We started about education, and I'm spending a lot of time with education because that really is the way we transmit these values to the generations that come after us, so we ensure that not only the values continue, but that politics of humanity becomes a reality, right? We did not get to where we are as a country just because, right? Nobody in America woke up and said, I'm going to be racist. That's not the case. Nobody woke up and said, I'm just going to be sexist. These are things that are taught, right? These are learned ideals and behaviors. And so if we want to shift the way we engage each other, then we have to teach each other differently how we are to engage. That's why education is so important. What we ended off last week was really kind of pointing toward an Afrocentric approach to education. And the reason why I focus there on the Afrocentric approach is because across the continent of Africa, education prior to colonialism was really a means of self-discovery, right? And the purpose of education was to help you become a fully realized human being that saw themselves in the context of other human beings in balance with nature and the cosmos, right? So there was a spiritual context, there was the communal context, and there was the individual context, right? Mind, body, and spirit, me, us, we, all, it was that connectiveness where you could not act in a way that exploited others because you understood that by exploiting others, you exploited yourself, right? That's a shift in a value that gets us closer to that practice of a politics of humanity. So, again, if we want to change the status quo, we have to shift the way we're thinking about education, the way we teach ourselves how to be and exist in the world. And the Afrocentric approach to education, I think, provides us at least a framework for how we might do that. Two examples that I think are very compelling are the way the Dagara people that are in Burkina Faso, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast teach their young people, and the way the Dogon people do. So the Dagara are written about by the author Malidoma Patrice Some. He's of the Dagara people, and at 4 years old, he was kidnapped and indoctrinated by French Jesuit priests to later go back to his people on behalf of the colonizer and not only bring his ethnic group, his clan, his tribe to, a belief in Jesus or Christ, but also then, resources and the like, right? So his indoctrination lasted for about 15 years, and at 20 years old, he returned to his village and realized that he did not fit in. So the whole time that he was with the French Jesuit priests, they were treating him relatively well, right? He was not technically a slave. He had been, yes, kidnapped from his people, but they were educating him. He was learning geography. He was learning mathematics, the sciences, anatomy, languages, European history, European literature. But as he escaped and returned, he realized that all of that education he had from a Western or Eurocentric perspective caused him to have a different consciousness, right? And when he returned to his people, he did not fit in. Instead of rejecting him, his people went through a process of reprogramming his mind and his consciousness through the rites of passage process. And what he said was that by going through the rites of passage process, he was no longer afraid, he was no longer confused, and it allowed him, he no longer afraid, no longer confused. He did not feel any more helplessness and pain. And that process opened the door to the will of his ancestors, allowing him to fully return to his people and to his spiritual purpose, right? So it's interesting that, in a Eurocentric context, in a Western framework, we would argue that the best education to be had in the world is one at a Western university, right? A Jesuit university, even in the United States, is not a bad education. But in the context of creating a healthy, happy, and whole human being who is not of European descent, that is not necessarily the best education that one could have, right? Because it does not focus that person as a human being in the appropriate cultural and spiritual context, right? So he had to go through a rites of passage, and his people helped him return to himself. And in returning to himself, he then understood his purpose. He understood his connection spiritually and otherwise to the people, to the land, and to the spiritual energy to which he belonged and came from. Imagine in America and the West what our neighborhoods would be if we had an educational process that helped children of African descent center themselves in such a way that they would return to their right minds. What if in the West, every child had access to an education that centered them in their right minds, in community, and in connection to the planet and the cosmos, right? Right now, especially in America, we educate young people to work, right? To become cogs in a wheel, to pay taxes, to hopefully be good neighbors. But if you make a lot of money and you accrue material wealth, then you're successful, right? The Dagara are completely opposite. Wealth in their context is really manifested in the way that elders are perceived and appreciated by the community based on their investment in that community, the value add they are to that community. So the more value you add to others, the more wealthy you become from a Dagara cultural framework. Completely different from an investment in material wealth that singles one out from others. I have Jordans, I have a mansion, I have a Tesla, I have whatever sign of material wealth, and you don't, therefore, right? In the Dagara people and really throughout the African continent, wealth can be material. It's not to say that material wealth is not a thing, but in many of the cultures I've studied, even more important than material wealth is the value add to the community, even from a standpoint of power. Those who are called kings or queens, it's not king and queen in the feudal sense of the European tradition. The king and queen in an African context, more often than not, is the guardian and protector of the people and the people's resources, right? Totally different. It's not feudal. It's not because I'm the monarch, I own the land and the people on it and the resources, right? No. Because I'm the monarch, my job, my sole responsibility is to either be the spiritual leader, be the protector of people and resources, or all of that. It's a responsibility to ensure the safety and the productivity in terms of humanity of the people, and not necessarily the productivity in terms of material resources. Completely different cultural context, right? In fact, in the Dagara culture, they have a saying and a belief that the children are the most important people in that community. And as a result, there is no generation gap. We always talk about the generation gap. Oh, even in the black community in America, black America, the older civil rights leaders say the younger civil rights leaders, they don't hear them. The younger civil rights leaders say the older civil rights leaders don't hear them. There's some kind of generation gap, right? They're speaking different languages. They have different ideas and ideals. And in the Dagara context, that's not the case, because the children are the most important people in the community, and so are the elders. And because the kids come from the ancestral realm and the elders are on their way to the ancestral realm, they have a bond that cannot be broken even by parents. And the majority of the time during the early life of a child is spent with their grandparents, right? And the Dagara say, or Maladoma writes, that they pass secrets back and forth. So the children tell the elders of the ancestral realm, and the elders help the children prepare for the life ahead of them. So they are close. There's a bond, familial, culturally, spiritually, that, is such to extent that there is no generation gap. In America, in the West, we favor youth over experience and wisdom. And there really is no place for the elders in our community. How do we know? Just go to quote unquote senior citizens home, right? And see how these folks are often treated, even with the best intentions, right? When I look at my father-in-law in the place that he resides, it's an assisted living home, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart that as a culture, as a society, we do not do better by way of taking care of our elders. And there seems to be no place in Western culture for that to happen by default in terms of the relationship between our children and our elders. Whereas the Dagara people, it is a matter of culture. There is no debate. There's no question. If I were to have a child in the Dagara context, my wife and I have a child, that child belongs not to us, but to the community, and most importantly, to our parents until they reach the preteen age, and then things start to shift, right? Imagine if in the Western context, we had a place for our elders to pass down the best of who we are to our children. It not only gives value or adds value to the lives of the elder, it makes sure that the young people appreciate their elders, right? And then you don't have a generation gap, right? This is all education in this context. It's not just about formal sitting down with a book and learning and then regurgitating some facts. No, this is about how to be as a human being, right? So education takes on, in the Dagara context, a more holistic component of life, health, wealth, but wealth is shifted from material to value. Does that make sense? I'm going to play a little bit and then we'll talk about the Dogon. Solid. So we talked about the cultural value add that education communicates through elders to the children of the Dagara, right? Wealth is the value add to the community that then generates respect and affection and attention even to the elders, right? The more respect you have as an elder from your people, it represents the more value you've added over life, right? As opposed to the accumulation of material wealth. And there is no generation gap because those values are transmitted from the elders to the children, from infant up to preteen, right? It's not so much, again, the formality of learning the way we know it in the West. Nobody's sitting at a desk and reading a book. And it's not because they don't have these things, right? It's because culturally, that is not the goal. The goal is not to regurgitate facts and information that may or may not be useful. It's to be a healthy, happy, and whole human being who's ultimately purposed to add value to the community and the world, right? Completely different idea of what education is. And so the other idea is the Dogon. The other example is the Dogon. The Dogon people invest similarly in their children because of many of the similar cultural values, right? Children are important. They want to transmit those cultural values, those spiritual values to their children. But in their tradition, they have a slightly more formalized approach in terms of the levels of education, right? It still comes from elders. An elder called the Hogan is a spiritual teacher. And after you get to a certain level, and I'll go through those levels here in a second, the Hogan is a spiritual teacher who can only answer the question you asked, right? Because if I answer the question that I perceive based on the subtext of your question, then I'm not allowing you to discover the answer from the inside out, right? I am telling you what to think as opposed to teaching you how to think. And so they go through these 4 levels and they get to this point where it's incumbent upon the student to think and reflect on what has been taught and learned, and then generate questions for themselves that guide them to their purpose, right? Again, it's that inside out as opposed to outside in approach. So there are 4 levels in Dogon education. The Giriso, which is the foreword, right? It deals with concrete ideas, right? Simplified knowledge. The Beniso is the side word. Now we're talking about dimensions and everything, right? It's very cool. It expands upon the Giriso, but goes deeper in terms of understanding through explanations. The Boloso is the backword, right? It completes the Giriso and Beniso and begins to move from those concrete ideas to more abstract, esoteric ideas dealing with spirit, right, which is the Sodai, the clear word. And so in the Dogon context, knowledge is clear and secrets are revealed so that the student fully has an understanding of the universe as understood by their culture and one's place in the human family, right? So you start 1 + 1 is 2, very concrete. You can take 2 blocks and take one away, and that's 1 block, put another one there, and you have 2, very concrete. And then you get a little more abstract, solve for X, right? And then you get even more abstract until now you're dealing with math that aligns with logic and metaphysics and these more esoteric ideas, right? That is the Dogon. And what's interesting about the Dogon is they already have more elements on their periodic table than we found in the West. They, without computers, understood that there was Sirius A and it was orbited by Sirius B, which you cannot see with the naked eye. And it wasn't until the 1950s that Western scientists really understood that Sirius B existed. They call it Potolo. And in their cosmology, they say that's where they came from. How do they get this information? How do they understand, every 60 years is when you can see Sirius B with a telescope. And they never had a telescope, but they have masks that only are worn and made every 60 years in the Festival of Sigi to celebrate the orbit of Sirius B, right? The innerverse, understanding and becoming one with the cosmos and the planet, helps you to what some scholars say, understand, right? So when you find yourself, you find everything else. If you see yourself and become one with the universe, then you understand the universe, right? And they understand energy at the most intuitive level. So when they're drawing a pail of water, right, and they see the ripples that come from the bucket, they see that as energy waves, right? They had an idea of string theory before Stephen Hawking was even born, and they used the language of the spider's web with the same concepts, right? You're connected through this web where Hawking says we're connected through these strings, right? They understand multiple universe and dimensions, all of these things, and they never have had a computer, right? They don't have, formal libraries in the way that we in the West think of libraries. They do have a system of writing, as do many African cultures, and they do have a system of cataloging these ideas, but really it's the infusion of spirit in the context of community that brings about this connectedness and reveals this information, right? And a lot of people say, oh, Lomax, that's weird, that's spooky, that's not empirical or whatever. And I will tell you this, I've been playing drums since I was 2. Nobody taught me how to play the drums. I've never had a formal lesson that got me to somewhere new on the drum set. Now, I have had lessons. I had to have lessons in college. But my lessons consisted of me sitting with my drum teacher and talking about the gigs last night. It wasn't him showing me, something to do. Where did that knowledge come from? Right? When you have young people who can just sing, young people who can just draw, or young people who are good with numbers, anything. Kids come here with talents and abilities. The problem in the West is that we often educate these young people away from their innate abilities instead of engaging them so those young people can leverage those abilities to add value to the culture while making a living, right? In fact, I've talked about this before. There are no less than 3 books that have been published in the last 20 years that have somewhere in their title, The Dumbing Down of America. And what a lot of the recent research shows is that children are born brilliant. It's through the process of education in the West that they begin to dull their senses, because our educational process is more about indoctrinating them to conform rather than to be the brilliant human beings that they are born to be. So what would happen if we adapted the best of these quote-unquote indigenous and quote-unquote third world educational processes to bring about and enhance the brilliance of our children, no matter where they were? Like, these ideas are not new, they're ancient, and they're not radical, right? The only thing that makes it radical is that we've built systems and infrastructure and a way of life around things that don't work for human beings. But they do work for captains of industry who exploit human beings for personal gain. And we think that that is success. I argue that success is the connectivity that we share as human beings. And what we can do through that connectivity, I call it activating trust, right? You build your circle of trust, like they say on Meet the Fockers, right? One of the most hilarious films, De Niro. He's like, are you in my circle of trust, right? And once you find people you can trust, you build community on that trust. And then when you leverage that trust to do something significant for the community, you have activated that trust. Right? And as a nation that's built on supposedly this trust, because we don't have blood connections necessarily, right? We should trust each other based on our citizenship, right? How do we activate that trust as Americans to create the America we always want for each of us, right? We always want a place where our children can be better than us. Our children can have opportunities that we didn't have. And thus, it just keeps growing. It keeps going, right? How do you create that America? I think practicing or cultivating a practice of a politics of humanity where we use power to enable all of us to be our best selves is that way. And we use education to cultivate a practice of transmitting those cultural values so our children build upon what we start now. It's not too late, right? America's a young country. It really is. And I would never say that I'm the most patriotic person. I'm not. I happen to be African American in a place that doesn't really like us, right? But what I do know is that as long as we are breathing, we have hope. And as long as we can connect through our hope to make the place better, and we commit to that work of making and improving our situation and making the country better, we can do it. But as most psychologists in the Afrocentric space say or have found, if you experience a trauma for X amount of years, it's going to take at least that many years from the time you begin working to heal from that trauma, right? From the time you start working, if it took 7 years, if you experience trauma for 7 years, from the day you begin to heal, it's going to take you 7 years to fully heal. And we've been experiencing a lot of the stuff that is foundational to how our society is now for 401 years, right? So this is generational work. And I'm not saying it necessarily has to take 400 years. I mean, we can put the work in, right? But we cannot see it as a short return, right? We do something great today and tomorrow there's an immediate return. No, we have to invest in our children. And one of the best ways we can do that is by investing in an education that helps them become fully human, healthy, happy, and whole human beings who see themselves in the context of each other, the wider community, the planet, and the cosmos, right? And once you do that, then your purpose is not necessarily to just take care of you. It's to take care of each other. And that's where the value add comes from. That's the third part of that culture shift, right? The macro culture shift, the reimagining of education, and then adding value. I think it was Teddy Roosevelt who said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, right? How about we expand that? Ask not what humanity can do for you, because if it's operating optimally, it is providing a platform for you then to be your brilliant self and add value to that community, that global humanity. And if it's not, then it's incumbent upon each of us as individuals to then, again, commit to each other to do the work of building a just and equitable, inclusive society. We can do it. We can do it. And if you believe with me that you can do it, then it's done in the spirit realm, right? Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture says, once you've conceived of your power, it is the so, right? Power begins at the point of conception. So does this work, right? We create this communal vision, and then we begin to build the infrastructure, the systems that lead then to a politics of humanity that ensures that our children's children live in America that is not only a great place to be, but a great place to live and grow as a human being. Ashe, I'm going to play us out, and I will see you all next time.